Some wounds never heal, they just learn to live quietly in the corners of our hearts. For 18 long winters, Isaac Magnus has carried the weight of losing his wife and 7-year-old daughter to an avalanche in Montana Territory, 1882. Then a blizzard brings a half-frozen young woman to his cabin door. When she looks up at him with familiar eyes, Isaac's world stops. Lily remembers nothing about her past, only fragments of falling from a wagon and wandering through snow for days. But Isaac sees something impossible in her face, his little girl, now grown into the woman she never had the chance to become. As the storm traps them together, one question haunts every moment. Could this lost stranger truly be his daughter, returned to him after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered daguerreotype sat on Isaac Magnus's rough-hewn mantle, its silver surface clouded with age and fingerprints from too many evenings when whiskey made him bold enough to hold it. In the faded image, a younger Isaac stood behind a chair where his wife Margaret sat, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of their 7-year-old daughter Rose. The photographer had captured them in their Sunday finest, Margaret's dark hair pinned back in the fashion of the day, Rose's eyes bright with the kind of mischief that made Isaac's chest tighten even now. 18 years had passed since that photograph was taken. 18 years since the avalanche that took everything that mattered and left him with nothing but memories and the echo of his own voice, calling their names into the white silence. The cabin where Isaac now lived was not the home they had shared. That house lay buried beneath tons of snow and rock somewhere up the mountain, along with the life he had once known. This place was smaller, practical, built with the efficiency of a man who no longer expected company or comfort. One room served as kitchen, sitting area, and bedroom. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising through the peaked roof with steady reliability. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, tools, and the few books he had managed to salvage from his former life. Every morning for 18 years, Isaac had risen before dawn to tend the fire, check his traps, and maintain the routines that kept a man alive in the Montana wilderness. He had grown lean and weathered, his dark hair now streaked with silver, his hands scarred from countless repairs and improvements to his solitary domain. The mountains had shaped him into something harder than the boy who had first come west with dreams of gold and adventure. He had been a different man then. Before the war, before Margaret, before Rose, before the avalanche that taught him how quickly joy could be buried beneath an indifferent world. In those early days, he had worked claims with other hopeful men, spent evenings in saloons, sharing stories and whiskey, written letters home to family in Pennsylvania, who eventually stopped writing back when his replies grew sparse and distant. The war had found him anyway, as wars do. When news reached the territory that the Union needed men, Isaac had volunteered, leaving Margaret and infant Rose with her parents while he served 2 years with a Colorado regiment. He had returned, changed, quieter, more grateful for the simple peace of mountain mornings and his daughter's laughter. The medal he earned for actions at Glorieta Pass remained wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his trunk, along with other remnants of that distant life. Margaret had understood his silence about the war, just as she understood his need to move them further into the mountains, away from the growing settlements and the memories of battles fought in places that seemed more like nightmares than geography. She had never complained about the isolation, content to tend their garden, teach Rose her letters, and fill their evenings with songs and stories that made their small house feel like the center of the world. Rose had been the light of their lives, a child who found wonder in everything from the patterns frost made on windows to the way elk moved through the timber like ghosts. She had her mother's dark eyes and Isaac's stubborn curiosity, asking endless questions about how things worked and why the sky changed colors and whether the mountains had always been there or if they grew like trees. Isaac had carved her dolls from pine, built her a swing from a sturdy branch, taught her to identify animal tracks and the calls of different birds. The avalanche had come in late March, when the snow was heavy and unstable from unseasonable warm days, followed by bitter cold nights. Isaac had been checking his trap lines higher up the mountain when he heard the sound, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, growing louder until it filled the entire world. By the time he reached where their house had stood, there was nothing but a field of white stretching between the trees, as if his family had never existed at all. He had dug for 3 days straight, his hands bleeding, his voice raw from calling their names. Other men from the settlement had come to help, but the snow was deep and hard-packed, and winter was not finished with them yet. When they finally found Margaret, she was holding Rose close, both of them peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep together. Isaac had carried them down the mountain wrapped in blankets and buried them in the small cemetery behind the church, their graves marked with a wooden cross he had carved with his own hands. That was the last time Isaac Magnus had spoken to God. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of survival and solitude. He had built his new cabin on the opposite side of the valley, far enough from the avalanche site that he could not see the scar it had left on the mountainside, but close enough that he never forgot what the mountains could take from a man. He had learned to live with the silence, to find a kind of peace in the rhythm of seasons and the predictable challenges of staying alive, in a place that demanded everything and gave back only what a man could earn through sweat and vigilance. Neighbors from the settlement had tried to visit in the early years, bringing food and awkward condolences, but Isaac had made it clear that he preferred to be left alone. The widow Henderson had even made a few determined attempts to draw him back into the community, appearing at his door with fresh bread and gentle conversation about church services and social gatherings. But Isaac had no use for gatherings or the well-meaning sympathy of people who still had intact families to return home to each evening. He had become, by choice and circumstance, a man apart. The few times necessity forced him to venture into town for supplies, people nodded respectfully but kept their distance. They knew his story, respected his grief, and understood that some losses carved a man into a shape that could no longer fit comfortably among others. His days followed patterns worn smooth by repetition. Rise before dawn, tend the fire, check the weather, prepare coffee strong enough to cut through mountain cold. Mornings were for hunting or checking traps, afternoons for maintenance and repairs, evenings for reading by firelight until his eyes grew heavy. He had worn through 3 copies of Shakespeare's complete works, memorized most of Whitman's poetry, and could recite passages from the Bible despite his quarrel with its author. The seasons marked time more reliably than any calendar. Spring meant repairing winter damage and planting the small garden that supplemented his diet of game and preserved foods. Summer brought the work of cutting and storing firewood, maintaining his equipment, and preparing for the isolation that winter would bring. Fall was for hunting and final preparations, the race against weather that could turn deadly with little warning. Winter was the true test, the months when the mountains showed their teeth, and a man learned whether he had prepared well enough to see another spring. Isaac had survived 18 of them alone, each one teaching him something new about endurance, about the fine line between solitude and madness, about the way memory could keep a man warm when the fire burned low and the wind howled like voices calling from another world. He had grown skilled in all the arts of mountain survival. His aim with a rifle remained true. His traps were cunningly placed and well-maintained. His weather sense had developed to the point where he could smell snow hours before the first flakes fell. He could track game through terrain that would challenge an Indian scout, and his knowledge of which plants could heal and which could kill had saved his life more than once during the lean times. But on this particular evening, in early December, as the wind began to shift and the air took on the heavy feeling that promised serious weather, Isaac Magnus sat in his chair by the fire and studied the daguerreotype with the same mixture of pain and comfort it had brought him for 18 years. The faces looking back at him seemed almost to move in the flickering light. Margaret's gentle smile and Rose's bright eyes, as vivid as if they had posed for the photograph yesterday instead of in another lifetime. Outside, the first snowflakes of what promised to be a significant storm began to tap against his windows like fingers seeking entry. Isaac set the photograph back on the mantel, added wood to the fire, and settled in with a book of Tennyson's poetry, expecting nothing from the night ahead but the familiar companionship of wind and verse. He had no way of knowing that before morning, his carefully ordered world would be shattered by a sound he had not heard in 18 years, another human voice calling for help through the storm, bringing with it the possibility that some miracles arrive, disguised as disasters, and that the mountain that had taken everything might yet give something back. The pounding on his door came near midnight, faint at first beneath the howling wind, then more insistent. Isaac set down his book and listened, certain the storm was playing tricks on his ears. 18 years of solitude had taught him to distinguish between the sounds the wind could make and the sounds it could not. This was different. This was human. He moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. The storm had intensified beyond anything he had expected, transforming his familiar yard into a white chaos where shapes appeared and vanished like ghosts. Then he saw her, a dark figure collapsed against his door, one arm raised to knock again before falling limp to her side. Isaac grabbed his coat and rifle from their hooks beside the door. In the mountains, caution kept a man alive, and even desperate strangers could bring danger. But when he opened the door, the wind nearly drove him back inside, and the figure at his threshold was clearly no threat to anyone. She was young, perhaps 25, and half dead from cold. Her dark hair hung in frozen strands around a face so pale it seemed translucent in the lamplight, spilling from his cabin. She wore a torn blue dress that had once been fine quality, its fabric soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. No coat, no gloves, boots that were little more than leather scraps held together by stubbornness and prayer. But it was her eyes that stopped Isaac's heart. Even clouded with exhaustion and confusion, they were unmistakably familiar. The same dark brown, the same shape, the same way of looking at the world with a mixture of intelligence and wonder that he had seen every day for 7 years and mourned every day since. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I'm lost." Isaac caught her as she collapsed forward, her body frighteningly light in his arms. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the wind, and laid her gently on his bed. Her skin was ice-cold to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid. He had seen enough men die of exposure to know she was close to the edge. Working with the efficiency of long practice, Isaac stripped away her wet clothes and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost stifling, then heated water and began the slow process of bringing life back to frozen limbs. He had done this for fellow soldiers during the war, men who had spent too long in winter trenches, and the procedure was as methodical as any other survival skill. As he worked, massaging circulation back into her hands and feet, Isaac found himself studying her face with an intensity that both amazed and disturbed him. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, yet impossible to accept. Rose would be 25 now, if she had lived. This woman was the right age, had the right coloring, even had a small scar on her chin that made Isaac's breath catch because Rose had fallen and cut herself in that exact spot when she was 5 years old. But Rose was dead. Isaac had held her small, cold body in his arms. He had carved her name into the wooden cross that marked her grave. Grief might play tricks on a lonely man's mind, but it could not raise the dead or deliver them to his door in the middle of a blizzard. The woman stirred as warmth began to return to her body, mumbling words he could not understand. Isaac continued his ministrations, checking her fingers and toes for signs of frostbite, relieved to find that while she was severely chilled, she would likely keep all her extremities. Her pulse was growing stronger, her breathing deeper and more regular. When she finally opened her eyes, She looked directly at Isaac. With the same expression of confused trust he remembered from Rose's childhood illnesses, the look of someone who was hurt and afraid, but somehow knew they were safe. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "My cabin," Isaac replied, his own voice sounding strange after hours of silence. "You're safe now. You were nearly frozen when you found my door." She tried to sit up, then fell back against the pillows with a grimace of pain. I can't remember how I got here. There was a wagon, and falling, and so much cold." "Easy now," Isaac said, settling into the chair he had pulled beside the bed. "You've been through something terrible. Memory sometimes needs time to come back after a shock like that." She studied his face with those achingly familiar eyes. "You saved my life. The storm drove you here. I just got you warm and dry. What's your name?" Isaac hesitated. He had spoken his own name aloud so rarely in the past 18 years that it felt foreign on his tongue. "Isaac Magnus. I'm—" She paused, her brow furrowing with concentration. "I think Lily." "Yes, Lily, but everything else is so unclear, like trying to remember a dream that keeps slipping away." Over the next 3 days, as the storm raged outside and made travel impossible, Isaac found himself caring for another human being for the first time since he had buried his family. He heated soup, changed bandages on cuts she had sustained during her ordeal, and gradually coaxed more of her story from the fragments of memory that surfaced like pieces of a broken mirror. She remembered being in a wagon with an older couple, kind people who had been taking her somewhere important. She recalled the sound of the wagon wheel hitting something in the road, the sensation of falling, the cold shock of snow. After that, only wandering through the storm, following a light that must have been his cabin window. "They were taking me to find someone," she said on the point. Second evening, sitting up in bed while Isaac fed wood to the fire. "Someone important. I think it had to do with my family." Isaac's hand stilled on the poker. "Your family." "I don't have clear memories of my childhood," Lily explained, pulling the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "The people who raised me, the Hartleys, they said I came to them when I was very young, hurt and scared, with no memory of where I belonged. They were good to me, loved me like their own daughter. But they always wondered about my real family, and they were taking you to find them?" "Mrs. Hartley died last spring, Mr. Hartley this fall. Before he passed, he gave me some papers, some clues about where I might have come from. He said it was time I knew the truth about myself." She looked at Isaac with those eyes that made his chest tight. "I think that's where we were going when the accident happened." Isaac set down the poker and turned to face her fully. "Do you remember anything about this family you were looking for?" Lily closed her eyes, concentrating. "Fragments. A man with gentle hands who used to carve things from wood. A woman who sang lullabies about angels watching over children. And—" She opened her eyes suddenly, staring at Isaac with startled recognition. "Mountains. Always mountains. Like these." The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities that Isaac dared not name. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, as if the mountains themselves were conspiring to keep them together long enough for truth to surface from the snow-covered wreckage of the past. "Mr. Magnus," Lily said quietly, "have you lived here long?" 18 years, Isaac replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Alone?" Isaac nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "But not always alone." This time Isaac could only look at her, seeing in her face the ghost of the child he had lost, feeling in his chest the terrible, wonderful possibility that grief might not always have the final word, that some stories might have chapters yet unwritten, that miracles sometimes came disguised as disasters on the worst nights of winter. The storm howled around the cabin like a living thing, but inside, by the warmth of the fire, two souls who had been lost in different kinds of wilderness began the slow, careful process of finding each other again. By the fourth morning, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the pale sunlight. Lily had regained enough strength to move around the cabin, though Isaac insisted she take things slowly. He watched her with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read the subtle signs of recovery, noting the return of color to her cheeks and the steadier rhythm of her breathing. She was different from any woman he had known, even Margaret. There was something ethereal about the way she moved through his rough space, as if she belonged to a gentler world but had somehow learned to adapt to harder circumstances. When she helped him prepare breakfast, her hands moved with unconscious grace as she stirred the porridge, and Isaac found himself remembering mornings when Rose had stood on a wooden crate beside Margaret, learning the mysteries of cooking with the intense concentration only children could bring to such tasks. "You have kind eyes," Lily said suddenly, catching him watching her. "They remind me of someone, though I can't place who." Isaac turned back to the coffee pot, unwilling to let her see the effect her words had on him. "You're feeling better this morning." "Much better, thanks to you." She paused in her stirring, looking around the cabin with obvious curiosity. "This is a beautiful place, but it feels, I hope you don't mind me saying, it feels like something's missing." Isaac's hand tightened on his cup. "Missing? Empty spaces," Lily said gently. "Places where other things used to be." The mantel could hold more than just that one photograph. There are hooks on the wall, with nothing hanging from them. The table is sized for more than one person, but you only have one chair pulled up to it. She was observant, perhaps too much so. Isaac had thought he had erased all traces of his former life, but apparently the absence of things left its own kind of evidence. He had never considered that emptiness could be as revealing as fullness. "I live alone," he said simply. "But you didn't always." It was not a question. Isaac set down his coffee and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley where his old life lay buried. Behind him, he heard Lily moving quietly, respectfully, giving him space to decide how much of his story he was willing to share. "I had a family once," he said finally. "A long time ago. What happened to them?" Isaac turned to find her sitting at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes filled with gentle patience. In that moment, she looked so much like Rose that Isaac had to grip the windowsill to steady himself. "Avalanche," he said. 18 years ago this spring. My wife Margaret and my daughter Rose. They were in the house when the mountain came down." Lily's intake of breath was soft but sharp. "Oh, Isaac, I'm so sorry." "Rose was 7, Isaac continued, the words coming easier now that he had started. "Bright as a new penny, always asking questions, always getting into mischief. She had—" He stopped, realizing he was about to describe the same dark eyes and curious nature that he saw in the woman before him. "She had what?" "She had her mother's eyes," Isaac said quietly. "And my stubborn streak made her fearless sometimes, which worried Margaret to no end." Lily smiled sadly. "She sounds wonderful." "Both of them do." They were. Isaac returned to the table, settling into his chair across from her. "I tried to find them, dug for days, but the snow was too deep, too hard-packed. When we finally reached them, they were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "That's why you live alone." Seemed easier than pretending I could be part of the world again. Lily reached across the table and touched his hand, a gesture so natural and comforting that Isaac felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "But you saved me. That doesn't sound like a man who's given up on the world entirely. You needed help. Anyone would have done the same." "Would they? I've heard stories about mountain men who've grown so used to solitude that they drive strangers away rather than welcome them in. But you didn't. You brought me inside, cared for me, shared your food and warmth and—" She gestured around the cabin. "Your home." That night, as Isaac lay on the floor beside the fire, listening to Lily's steady breathing from the bed, she began to speak into the darkness. "I dream about falling," she said softly. "But not just from the wagon. Other falling down a hill covered with snow, someone calling my name, strong arms catching me before I hit the ground." Isaac's breath caught. Rose had been playing on a snowy slope behind their house the winter before she died, had slipped and tumbled down the hill. Isaac had been splitting wood nearby and had caught her just before she would have crashed into a fallen log. "Do you remember the name they called?" he asked carefully. "It starts with R, I think, but then everything gets confused, like someone threw a blanket over my memories." Isaac stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding. Rose! They had called her Rose. "Isaac?" Lily's voice was drowsy but concerned. "Are you all right?" Your breathing changed. "I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" "About impossible possibilities. About the way you look at me, like you know me from somewhere deeper than memory. About how your laugh sounds like echoes from a life I thought was finished forever. About how strange life can be," Isaac said instead. "How it can take everything away and then, years later, bring something unexpected right to your door. Do you think," Lily hesitated, "do you think some things are meant to happen, even when they seem impossible?" "I used to think everything happened for a reason," Isaac replied. "Then I decided nothing did. Now I'm not sure what I believe." The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of mountain cold that made every breath visible. Lily insisted on helping Isaac with his daily routines, and he found himself teaching her things he hadn't shared with another person in 18 years. How to read weather signs in the way clouds gathered around the peaks. How to move quietly through snow without leaving an obvious trail. How to identify the tracks of different animals and guess at their intentions. She was a quick learner, absorbing his lessons with the same eager curiosity that Rose had brought to everything. When Isaac showed her how to split kindling, her first attempts were clumsy but determined. When he demonstrated the proper way to bank a fire for the night, she watched with intense concentration, asking questions that showed she understood not just the how, but the why of mountain survival. "You're a good teacher," she said as they worked together to clear snow from the path to his woodshed. "Patient. I bet your daughter loved learning things from you." Isaac paused in his shoveling. "She did. Rose was always wanting to help, even when she was too small to be much use. Margaret would find her trying to cook breakfast or mend clothes, making twice as much work for herself, but so proud of what she was attempting. "She sounds like me," Lily said with a small laugh. "Always jumping into things before I fully understand them. Mrs. Hartley used to say I had more enthusiasm than sense." The innocent comment hit Isaac like a physical blow. Margaret had said exactly the same thing about Rose, usually while laughing as she cleaned up whatever enthusiastic disaster their daughter had created. As they worked side by side in the bright mountain air, Isaac found himself stealing glances at Lily, noting the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the way she hummed unconsciously while working, the way she automatically favored her left hand for delicate tasks. All small things, meaningless individually, but together they painted a picture that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The storm had brought him more than a stranger in need of rescue. It had brought him the most dangerous thing a man in his position could encounter: hope. On the 5th evening, as Isaac prepared their simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread, Lily began to hum a melody that made his hands still over the cooking pot. The tune was hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Then, without thinking, he found himself humming along, the harmony coming as naturally as breathing. Lily stopped abruptly, staring at him with wide eyes. "You know that song?" Isaac frowned, searching his memory. "It sounds familiar, but I can't recall where I heard it." "I don't know where I learned it either," Lily said slowly. "It just comes to me sometimes, especially when I'm feeling safe and content. Like now." She paused. "But when you joined in, it felt complete, like that's how it was always supposed to sound." Isaac ladled stew into their bowls, his mind racing. Margaret had sung to Rose every night, the same collection of lullabies her own mother had taught her. But this melody was different, somehow more personal, like something created just for their family. "Sing it again," he said quietly. Lily's voice was soft and clear as she began the wordless melody. Isaac closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, and suddenly he was back in their old house, listening to Margaret sing Rose to sleep on winter nights. But it wasn't Margaret's voice he remembered now, it was his own, harmonizing with his wife's as they stood together in their daughter's doorway, watching her drift off to dreams. "The angels are watching over you," Isaac whispered, the words surfacing from some deep well of memory. Lily's singing stopped so suddenly it was like a door slamming shut. "What did you say?" I don't know why I said that. It just felt like the words that belonged with the melody. "Those are the words," Lily breathed. "But I never remembered them before, only the tune." She stood up from the table, moving restlessly toward the window. "This is impossible. People don't just share random songs and memories with strangers." Isaac watched her silhouette against the frost-covered glass, his chest tight with emotions he had buried so deeply he had forgotten they existed. "Maybe we're not strangers." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Isaac walked to his storage area and pulled back a canvas tarp he hadn't disturbed in years. Underneath were the few belongings he had saved from his old life, items too precious to throw away, but too painful to look at regularly. His fingers found what he was searching for, a small wooden doll with yarn hair and a faded blue dress. When he turned around, Lily was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. He held out the doll, his hands trembling slightly. "This belonged to my daughter," he said. Lily approached slowly, as if the doll might bite her. When she reached out to touch it, her fingers traced the carved features with unconscious familiarity. "She's beautiful," Lily whispered. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. You made this?" Isaac nodded. "For Rose's 5th birthday. Took me 3 months to get the face right. Margaret helped with the clothes and hair." Lily cradled the doll against her chest, and the gesture was so natural, so right, that Isaac had to sit down heavily in his chair. She held the toy exactly the way Rose had, protective but gentle, as if it were a real child, needing comfort. "May I?" Lily's voice was barely audible. "May I hold her for a while?" "Of course." Isaac watched as Lily settled into the other chair, the doll still pressed close to her heart. Her eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if she was seeing something far beyond the walls of the cabin. "I remember a doll," she said slowly. "Not clearly, more like shadows and feelings. Someone made it especially for me. It had," she examined Rose's doll more closely. "It had a dress just this color, and the hair," she touched the yarn hair, "soft and brown, tied with tiny ribbons." Isaac's voice came out as a croak. "What happened to your doll?" "I don't know. After whatever happened to me as a child, there were so many things I couldn't remember. The Hartleys tried to help me piece things together, but it was like trying to assemble a puzzle with most of the pieces missing." She looked up at Isaac, tears shining in her eyes. "But holding this one feels like coming home." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Isaac found himself studying every detail of Lily's face, comparing it to his memories of Rose, to the daguerreotype on the mantel, to the images he had carried in his heart for 18 years. The resemblance was undeniable, but resemblance wasn't proof. The world was full of people who looked like other people. But the song, the way she held the doll, the scar on her chin, the unconscious mannerisms that echoed his daughter's personality. Each detail alone could be explained away as coincidence, but together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. "Lily," Isaac said carefully, "you said the Hartleys found you when you were young. Do you remember how old you were?" 7, they thought. Maybe 8. I was so confused and frightened that it was hard to tell. They said I'd been hurt, had a head injury that explained why I couldn't remember anything about my life before. 7. Rose had been 7 when the avalanche took her, and this was 18 years ago. Lily nodded, give or take. The Hartleys weren't exactly sure of the date when they found me. It was spring, they said, late March or early April. Isaac's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. The avalanche had happened on March 28th, 1864. He remembered the date because it was etched on the wooden cross that marked what he had thought was his daughter's grave. "Where did they find you?" he asked, though he was almost afraid to hear the answer. "About 50 miles south of here, near the settlement at Copper Falls. I was wandering in the woods, half frozen and delirious. They said it was a miracle I had survived." Lily paused, her brow furrowing in concentration. They always wondered how a child could have traveled so far alone, especially in that condition. It was like I had walked out of nowhere. Or, Isaac thought, like she had walked away from an avalanche that everyone assumed had killed her. Like she had been thrown clear somehow, injured and confused, and had wandered until kind strangers found her and gave her a new name and a new life. The doll slipped from Lily's hands as she stood up suddenly, her face pale with shock. "Isaac, what are you thinking? I can see it in your eyes. You're thinking something impossible." Isaac rose to face her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "I'm thinking that sometimes the impossible is just the truth wearing a disguise we don't recognize." "That's not an answer." "I'm thinking," Isaac said slowly, each word weighted with 18 years of grief and hope, "that my daughter's body was never found. That we buried an empty grave because we couldn't bear to leave the mountainside without some kind of ceremony, some way to say goodbye." Lily stared at him, her dark eyes, Rose's eyes, wide with dawning understanding and terror. "I'm thinking," Isaac continued, his voice breaking, "that miracles sometimes take 18 years to find their way home." The morning after Isaac's revelation, Lily stood at the window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. She had barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities that seemed too extraordinary to believe, yet too detailed to dismiss. Isaac moved quietly around the cabin, preparing breakfast with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to find comfort in routine. "We need to find the wagon," Lily said without turning from the window. "If I'm going to understand who I really am, I need to see what's left of my journey to get here." Isaac paused in his coffee preparation. "The snow is deep, and we don't know exactly where, but you could find it." She turned to face him, and Isaac was struck again by the intensity in her dark eyes. "You were a soldier. You know how to track, how to read signs. You could find where I came from." Isaac studied her face, seeing determination mixed with fear. She was right, he could probably locate the wagon, even after the storm. His years in the mountains had taught him to read the landscape like a book, and his military training had honed those skills into something approaching art. But finding the wagon meant confronting evidence that might shatter the fragile hope that had taken root in his heart, or worse, confirm it in ways that would change everything. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "The terrain is rough, and winter weather can turn deadly without warning." "More dangerous than not knowing?" Lily asked. "Isaac, if there's even a chance that what you're thinking is true, don't we owe it to ourselves, to your daughter, to find out for certain?" Isaac saw his younger self in her determination, the same stubborn refusal to accept uncertainty that had driven him to dig for 3 days in the avalanche site 18 years ago. Perhaps it was that recognition that made his decision for him. "We'll need to prepare carefully," he said. "The wagon could be anywhere within a 10-mile radius, and we'll have to be ready to stay out overnight if the weather turns." They spent the morning gathering supplies and equipment. Isaac pulled his old military pack from storage, checking the leather straps and buckles with the thoroughness of long habit. He selected their gear with the eye of a man who had learned that survival often depended on carrying exactly the right things and nothing more. Into the pack went blankets, food for 3 days, his fire-starting kit, rope, a small axe, ammunition for his rifle, and the compact medical supplies he had assembled over the years. He showed Lily how to layer her clothing for warmth and mobility, lending her one of his extra coats and a pair of boots that Margaret had worn for outdoor work. "Tell me about tracking," Lily said as they prepared to leave the cabin. "How do you know where to start looking?" Isaac shouldered his pack and picked up his rifle. "It's about reading the story the land tells you. weather patterns, natural drainage, where animals would travel and where they wouldn't. People in trouble follow predictable paths toward shelter, toward what looks like safety. They set out under a sky that promised fair weather, but carried the kind of high, thin clouds that could thicken quickly in mountain country. Isaac led them southeast from his cabin, following the natural contours of the valley, toward the area where a wagon traveling from Copper Falls would most likely encounter trouble. As they walked, Isaac found himself sharing knowledge he hadn't used in years, explaining how to read the subtle signs that marked safe passage through mountain terrain. Lily absorbed his lessons with the same eager attention she had shown for everything else, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and a natural instinct for the wilderness. "You're a natural at this," Isaac observed, as Lily correctly identified a curs, a set of deer tracks crossing their path. "Most people from settled areas would struggle with even the basics. Maybe it's not as foreign to me as it should be," Lily replied thoughtfully. "The Hartleys lived in town, but I always felt most comfortable outdoors. I used to walk in the woods for hours, and somehow I never got lost, even in places I'd never been before." Isaac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Rose had possessed the same uncanny sense of direction, an almost supernatural ability to find her way through the forest paths around their home. Margaret had joked that their daughter had inherited some ancient mountain wisdom from her father's side of the family. They found the first sign of the wagon around midday, broken branches on a stand of pine trees that marked where something large had passed through with considerable force. Isaac examined the damage carefully, noting the height and angle of the breaks, the way the bark had been scraped from the trunk. "The wagon was moving fast when it hit here," he said, pointing out the evidence to Lily, "probably trying to outrun the storm." Lily studied the damaged trees with a growing sense of recognition. "I remember this place. Not clearly, but there's something familiar about the way those two large rocks frame the valley." Isaac followed her gaze to the granite formations she indicated. They were distinctive landmarks, the kind of geological features that would stick in memory even during trauma. If Lily recognized them, they were on the right track. They followed the trail of destruction for another hour, finding more broken branches, gouges in the earth where wagon wheels had struggled for purchase on increasingly treacherous ground, and finally, scattered belongings that had been thrown clear when the wagon overturned. Isaac found a leather satchel caught in the branches of a fallen tree. Inside were documents that made his hands tremble as he read them. Adoption papers, bearing the name Lily Hartley, a letter of introduction to a territorial judge, and most significant of all, a bundle of official correspondence about a child named Rose Magnus, who had been reported missing after an avalanche 18 years ago. "What is it?" Lily asked, seeing the expression on his face. Isaac handed her the papers with hands that shook. As she read, he watched her face cycle through confusion, shock, and finally a kind of stunned recognition. "They were bringing me to find you," she whispered. "The Hartleys they knew. Somehow, they figured out who I really was, and they were bringing me home." Isaac nodded, unable to speak past the emotion closing his throat. The evidence was overwhelming now, too specific and detailed to be explained away by coincidence. The woman standing before him in the mountain snow, reading documents that bore his daughter's name, was Rose. His Rose, grown into the woman she was always meant to become. "There's more," Lily said softly, her voice thick with tears. "A letter from Mrs. Hartley to you. She writes that she always suspected I was your daughter, but she wanted to be certain before she broke your heart with false hope or your healing with painful truth." Isaac took the letter with reverent care, recognizing in its careful script the handwriting of a woman who had loved his daughter as her own, but had never forgotten that she belonged to someone else. "We need to find the wagon itself," Isaac said when he could finally speak. "There might be more photographs, personal belongings, anything that could help you remember." Lily folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside her coat. "Isaac, when we find the rest of it, when we know for certain, what happens then?" Isaac looked at this woman who was his daughter, seeing in her face the same mixture of courage and uncertainty that had made Rose such a remarkable child. He thought of 18 years of solitude, of grief that had carved him into someone he barely recognized, of the sudden possibility that love could return to his life in ways he had never dared imagine. "Then we figure out how to be a family again," he said simply. "If that's what you want." Lily's smile through her tears was radiant as sunrise over the mountains. "I want that more than anything in the world, Papa." The word hit Isaac like a physical blow, 25 years of love and loss compressed into a single syllable that shattered the last of his defenses. His daughter, his Rose, was alive, was here, was calling him Papa with the same voice that had filled his dreams for 18 lonely years. They held each other in the mountain silence, father and daughter reunited by the same wild forces that had torn them apart. While around them, the peaks stood witness to the kind of miracle that reminded men why they believed in things larger than themselves. They found the overturned wagon just as the afternoon light began to fade, its wooden frame partially buried under snow, but still recognizable among the scattered rocks where it had come to rest. Isaac approached it with the careful reverence one might show a grave site, understanding that this wreckage represented the final chapter of Rose's journey back to him. The wagon had been well built, designed for the rough mountain roads that connected the scattered settlements of Montana Territory. But the terrain here was treacherous even in good weather, and the driver had clearly been pushing hard to reach shelter before the storm hit. Isaac could read the story in the broken axle, the scattered cargo, the way the horses had broken free and disappeared into the wilderness. "I remember now," Rose said softly, and Isaac's heart leaped to hear her use the name she had been born with. The driver, Mr. Henderson, he kept looking at the sky and urging the horses faster. "Mrs. Henderson was holding my hand, telling me we were almost there, that we'd be safe soon." Isaac felt a pang of guilt at content. The mention of the Hendersons. They had died trying to reunite him with his daughter, sacrificing their lives for a reunion they would never witness. He said a silent prayer for their souls, promising to honor their memory by treasuring the gift they had died to deliver. Working together, Isaac and Rose cleared snow from the wagon bed, searching for any belongings that might have survived the crash. They found clothing, carefully packed and now mostly ruined by exposure, along with household items that spoke of lives being relocated rather than simply traveled. Then Rose's breath caught sharply. "Isaac, Papa, look at this." She held up a small object that made Isaac's world tilt on its axis. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful, hanging from a delicate chain. Isaac recognized it immediately. It had belonged to his mother, passed down through 3 generations of Magnus women. He had given it to Margaret on their wedding day, and she had worn it every day until her death. "Open it," Isaac whispered. Rose's fingers trembled as she worked the tiny clasp. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, one of Isaac as a young man, the other of Margaret holding infant Rose. But it was what was tucked behind the portraits that made them both gasp. A tiny lock of dark hair, so fine it could only have come from a baby's head. "This is mine," Rose said with absolute certainty. "I don't know how I know, but I can feel it. This locket has been with me my whole life, even when I couldn't remember where it came from." Isaac took the locket with reverent hands, studying the faces of his dead wife and infant daughter, seeing in them the echo of the woman who now stood before him. The lock of hair was the same shade as Rose's, the same texture. Margaret must have cut it and hidden it in the locket as a keepsake, never knowing that one day it would serve as proof of identity when all other evidence had been lost. "Mrs. Hartley must have saved it. Rose," it continued, her voice thick with emotion. "All these years, she kept it safe for me, waiting for the right time to help me understand what it meant." As they continued searching through the wagon's contents, more pieces of Rose's story emerged. There were documents showing that the Hartleys had spent years quietly investigating her origins, following leads that eventually pointed them toward the Magnus family and the avalanche that had supposedly claimed young Rose's life. There were letters from territorial officials, medical records documenting Rose's condition when she was found, and most remarkably, a detailed account of the Hartleys' growing suspicion that the child they had rescued and raised was not an orphan, but a daughter separated from a grieving father. "They were good people," Isaac said, as he read through Mrs. Hartley's careful notes. "They could have kept you forever, never told you the truth, and no one would have known the difference. Instead, they chose to help you find your way home." Rose wiped tears from her eyes as she examined a small wooden box that had somehow survived the crash intact. Inside were items from her childhood with the Hartleys: a pressed flower, a smooth stone from a creek, a small carved horse that Mr. Hartley had made for her 10th birthday. These were the treasures of a girl who had been loved and cherished, evidence that her 18 years away from Isaac had not been lost or wasted, but filled with kindness and care. "I had a good life with them," Rose said quietly. "They never made me feel like I was anything other than their true daughter. But there was always something missing, a piece of myself I couldn't quite grasp. Now I understand what it was." Isaac watched his daughter hold the mementos of her second childhood, and felt a complex mixture of gratitude and loss. He was grateful that Rose had found love and stability with the Hartleys, but he grieved for all the moments he had missed: her first steps as a toddler, her questions about the world, her laughter echoing through a house, the 1,000 small intimacies that make up the relationship between a father and daughter. "Do you remember anything about your life before the avalanche?" Isaac asked gently. Rose closed her eyes, concentrating. "Fragments, more now than before. I remember a man who smelled like wood shavings and pipe tobacco, who used to lift me up to see over the fence. I remember a woman with gentle hands who brushed my hair and sang to me. I remember feeling safe and loved, like I was exactly where I belonged." Isaac's throat tightened. He had indeed smelled of wood shavings from his carpentry work, and Margaret had brushed Rose's hair every night while singing the lullabies her own mother had taught her. "I remember a house with yellow curtains in the kitchen," Rose continued, her voice growing more confident as the memories surfaced. "And a big dog named Bear who let me ride on his back. And there was a special place, a clearing in the woods, where we would go to pick berries and watch the clouds." Each detail was correct, so specific and accurate that there could be no doubt about Rose's identity. Isaac felt the last of his protective skepticism crumble away, replaced by a joy so intense it was almost painful. As they finished gathering what they could from the wagon site, the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of amber and rose. Isaac and Rose worked in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Papa," Rose said as they prepared to make camp for the night, "I need you to know something. Even if we hadn't found all this evidence, even if I never remembered anything more than I already have, I would still want to stay with you. The moment I saw your face, something in my heart recognized you. You feel like home to me." Isaac pulled his daughter close, marveling at the solid reality of her presence. "After 18 years of embracing only memories and ghosts, you are home, Rose. You always were, even when we didn't know where to find each other." That night, as they sat by their small campfire under a canopy of mountain stars, Isaac told Rose stories of her mother, painting word pictures of the woman who had loved them both, with fierce devotion. Rose listened with the hunger of someone reclaiming a heritage she had almost lost, asking questions that helped Isaac remember details he thought had been buried too deeply to recover. In return, Rose shared memories of her life with the Hartleys, helping Isaac understand that his daughter had not merely survived their separation, but had thrived, growing into a woman of intelligence, compassion, and strength. The Hartleys had given her education, stability, and most importantly, the secure foundation of love that had enabled her to become the remarkable person she was. As the fire burned low and the mountain cold settled around them, father and daughter fell asleep side by side, finally reunited under the same stars that had watched over them both during 18 years of separation, their dreams filled with the promise of all the tomorrows they would now share. The journey to Copper Falls took them 2 days through terrain that tested even Isaac's considerable mountain skills. Rose proved herself an able traveling companion, adapting to the demands of wilderness travel with an ease that spoke to both her natural resilience and the practical education she had received from the Hartleys. They moved carefully through the snow-covered landscape, following game trails and natural passages that offered the safest route toward the settlement. Copper Falls was a modest community that had grown up around a mill and trading post, serving the scattered ranches and mining claims in the region. Isaac had visited it only rarely over the years, preferring to make his infrequent supply runs to larger towns where he was less likely to encounter people who knew his story. But this journey was different. This time he came not as a solitary, grieving man, but as a father seeking official confirmation of a miracle. The town's record-keeper was a meticulous man named Samuel Whitmore, whose office occupied the back room of the general store. Isaac had met him briefly years ago, and Whitmore remembered both Isaac's reputation as a recluse and the tragic story that had driven him to isolation. "Mr. Magnus," Whitmore said with obvious surprise when Isaac and Rose entered his cluttered office. "I never expected to see you here again." "And this young lady would be?" "That's what we're hoping you can help us determine," Isaac replied carefully. "We need to examine the birth and death records from 18 years ago, specifically around the time of the avalanche that destroyed my family." Whitmore's expression grew solemn. "Of course, that was a terrible tragedy. I remember the search efforts, the whole community turning out to help." He paused, studying Rose with growing curiosity. "May I ask what's prompted this inquiry?" Isaac exchanged glances with Rose, then pulled out the documents they had recovered from the wagon. "We have reason to believe that my daughter may have survived the avalanche and that this young woman might be her." Whitmore's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. That would be extraordinary. Please, sit down while I retrieve the relevant records." The record-keeper moved with practiced efficiency through his filing system, pulling out ledgers bound in cracked leather and pages yellowed with age. He set them on his desk and opened to the entries from March 1864, running his finger down columns of handwritten names and dates. "Here we are," he said, pointing to an entry near the bottom of a page. "March 28th, 1864. Margaret Magnus, age 29, killed in avalanche. Rose Magnus, age 7. He stopped abruptly, his finger hovering over the entry. "What is it?" Isaac asked, leaning forward. Whitmore looked up with a puzzled expression. "This is odd. The entry for your daughter says presumed dead in avalanche, not killed in avalanche like your wife's entry. I never noticed that distinction before." Isaac felt his heart begin to pound. "What does that mean?" "Well, it suggests that whoever made this entry, and it would have been my predecessor, old Thomas Brady, had some doubt about whether the child's body was actually recovered." Whitmore flipped through several more pages. "Let me check something else." Rose gripped Isaac's hand as they watched Whitmore search through additional records. The silence in the small office was broken only by the rustling of pages and the distant sounds of daily life in the settlement outside. "Here," Whitmore said suddenly, his voice excited. "April 15th, 1864. This is interesting indeed." He turned the ledger so Isaac and Rose could see the entry. "A child, approximately 7 years old, found wandering near Copper Falls. Severely injured, no memory of identity or origin. Taken in by James and Eleanor Hartley." Isaac stared at the entry, seeing his daughter's story written in faded ink by a man who had died years ago. The dates matched perfectly, 17 days between the avalanche and Rose being found. Just enough time for a confused, injured child to wander the 50 miles between the disaster site and Copper Falls. "There's more," Whitmore continued, turning to another section of records. I have documentation here of the Hartleys' formal adoption of the child, whom they named Lily. But look at this notation. He pointed to a marginal note, written in different handwriting. Someone, probably Brady again, wrote, "Possible connection to Magnus Avalanche, investigate when child recovers." But did he investigate? Rose asked, her voice tight with emotion. Whitmore shook his head. Brady died of pneumonia that winter, before he could follow up on his suspicions. In replacement, my predecessor apparently never noticed the notation, or if he did, he didn't understand its significance. Isaac felt a wave of mixed emotions wash over him. If Brady had lived, if he had pursued his suspicions, Isaac might have been reunited with his daughter years earlier. They might have shared her childhood, her adolescence, all the precious years that had been lost to separation and ignorance. But Rose seemed to read his thoughts. "Papa, if things had happened differently, I might not have become the person I am today. The Hartleys gave me things, education, stability, love, that shaped who I am. Maybe this was how it was supposed to happen." Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but the resemblance between you two is quite remarkable. Even if we didn't have these records, I think most people would assume you were related." "There's one more thing we need to confirm," Isaac said. "The Hartleys left documents indicating they had been researching Lily's origins for years. Do you have any record of their inquiries?" Whitmore nodded and pulled out a more recent ledger. "Indeed I do. Mrs. Hartley came here several times over the past 5 years, asking questions about the Avalanche, about your family, about whether there had ever been any doubt about your daughter's death. She was quite persistent and very thorough in her research. He showed them copies of letters Mrs. Hartley had written to various territorial officials requesting information about missing children and unsolved cases from the 1,860 seconds. Her investigation had been methodical and patient, following every lead until she had assembled a compelling case that Lily was actually Rose Magnus. She was preparing to contact you directly, Whitmore explained, but she wanted to be absolutely certain before she approached you with such extraordinary claims. Mrs. Hartley understood that false hope would be crueler than continued ignorance. Isaac read through Mrs. Hartley's correspondence with growing admiration for the woman who had raised his daughter. She had been motivated not by any desire to cause drama or disruption, but by a deep love for Rose and a conviction that every person deserved to know their true identity. According to her final letter to me, Whitmore continued, she had decided to bring Lily Rose to meet you this winter. She felt she had enough evidence to justify the risk, and she believed Rose was strong enough to handle whatever truth they might discover. Rose wiped tears from her eyes. She was dying when she made that decision. The consumption was already taking her, but she used her last months to plan this journey. She and Mr. Hartley gave up their final time together to bring me home. The weight of the Hartleys' sacrifice settled over the small office like a blessing. 2 people who had loved Rose as their own daughter had chosen to give her back to her original family, even though it meant losing her themselves. Their deaths in the wagon accident had been tragic, but Isaac understood now that they had died doing exactly what they had chosen to do, ensuring that Rose found her way back to where she belonged. "Mr. Whitmore," Isaac said formally, "I would like you to prepare new official records correcting the error about my daughter's death. Rose Magnus survived the avalanche of March 28, 1864, and has now been reunited with her family." Whitmore smiled broadly. "It would be my honor, Mr. Magnus. This is the kind of story that reminds us why we keep such careful records in the first place, not just to document the past, but to help people reclaim their true identities when the need arises." As Whitmore prepared the paperwork that would officially restore Rose to life in the territorial records, Isaac looked at his daughter and marveled at the complexity of the journey that had brought them back together. The avalanche that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. The 18 years of separation that had felt like a lifetime of loss had actually been preparation for this moment of reunion. "Papa," Rose said quietly. "What happens now? Where do we go from here?" Isaac took her hand, feeling the solid reality of her presence, the miracle of her existence. "Now we go home, Rose. We go home and we figure out how to be a family again. We honor the memory of your mother and the love of the Hartleys, and we build something new on the foundation of everything that's brought us to this moment." Outside, the winter sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Father and daughter walked out of the record-keeper's office and into their future together, carrying with them the official documentation of a miracle that had taken 18 years to complete itself. The long journey home was about to begin. The return journey to Isaac's cabin took on the quality of a pilgrimage. Father and daughter traveled slowly through the mountain landscape, stopping frequently not because the terrain demanded it, but because they had 18 years of conversation to catch up on. Every mile brought new memories to the surface for Rose, and with them, a deeper understanding of the life she had lost and found again. On their second day out from Copper Falls, as they made camp in a grove of pine trees that offered shelter from the wind, Rose asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Papa, I need to see where it happened, where our old house stood, where Mama died. I need to understand what I survived." Isaac had been dreading this request, knowing it was inevitable but hoping to delay it as long as possible. The avalanche site held too many memories, too much pain. He had not visited it since the day they buried Margaret, had deliberately built his new life on the opposite side of the valley to avoid the daily reminder of what he had lost. "It's not an easy place to reach," he said carefully. "The terrain is rough, and winter makes it dangerous. We could wait until spring, when travel is safer." Rose studied his face in the firelight, seeing past his practical concerns to the fear beneath. "You don't want to go there?" Isaac poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. "I haven't been back since we laid your mother to rest. Some places hold too much sorrow to visit without good reason." "But I am a good reason," Rose said gently. "I'm the daughter who survived, who came back. Maybe it's time that place held something other than just grief." Isaac looked across the fire at this remarkable woman who was his child, seeing in her face the same determined courage that had made 7-year-old Rose fearless in her explorations of their mountain home. She was right, of course. The avalanche site was part of her story, and she had every right to see it, to understand the forces that had shaped both their lives. "We'll go tomorrow," he said finally. "But we approach carefully, and we don't take unnecessary risks. That mountain has already taken enough from our family." They rose early the next morning, breaking camp while the stars were still bright in the pre-dawn sky. Isaac led them higher into the mountains, following paths he remembered from the days when he and Margaret had explored every ridge and valley within a day's walk of their home. The terrain grew steadily more rugged as they climbed, the snow deeper and more treacherous with each mile. Rose proved herself an able mountaineer, moving with the natural grace of someone who belonged in high places. She had inherited Isaac's sure footing and instinctive understanding of how to read the mountain's moods, skills that had probably saved her life during her confused wandering 18 years ago. "Tell me about Mama," Rose said as they paused to rest on a windswept ridge. "I remember fragments, her voice, her laugh, the way she smelled like lavender and bread, but I want to know who she really was." Isaac settled beside his daughter on a fallen log, grateful for the excuse to rest and remember. "Margaret was the strongest person I ever knew, though she would have laughed to hear me say it. She had a way of making everything better just by being present. When I came back from the war, I was—" He paused, searching for words. "I was damaged in ways I didn't understand. But Margaret saw past all that to whatever was still good in me. She loved you very much," Rose said with certainty. "How can you know that?" "Because she gave you a daughter who loves you the same way. That kind of love doesn't happen by accident. It's taught, passed down from one generation to the next." Isaac felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She wanted more children, but we were never blessed that way. She used to say that God had given us you to make up for quantity with quality. What was she like as a mother? Patient when you were stubborn, firm when you needed guidance, and endlessly creative in finding ways to teach you about the world. She made everything into a game or a story. When you were learning to read, she would hide letters around the house for you to find and arrange into words. When you couldn't sleep during thunderstorms, she would tell you that the lightning was God taking photographs of his favorite children. Rose smiled through her tears. I remember that story. Sometimes, when there are storms now, I still think about God with his camera. As they climbed higher, the landscape began to look familiar to Isaac in ways that made his chest tight with memory. They were approaching the valley where he had built his first life, where he had been happy in ways he had almost forgotten were possible. Every rock formation, every stand of trees, every turn in the path brought back images of Margaret walking beside him, of Rose running ahead to investigate some wonder that had caught her attention. I can feel it, Rose said suddenly as they crested a small rise. Something about this place, it feels like coming home. Isaac stopped walking, following Rose's gaze down into the valley below. There, nestled against the base of a steep mountainside, were the remnants of their old homestead. The avalanche had scoured the slope clean, leaving a stark white scar across the mountain face. But the lower portions of their property remained visible under the snow. There, Isaac said, pointing to a depression in the snow where their house had stood. That's where we lived, where you spent the first 7 years of your life. Rose stared at the sight with an expression of wonder and pain. It's beautiful. I can see why you and Mama chose this place. We thought we were building something permanent, Isaac said. A home that would last for generations, a place where our grandchildren would play in the same meadows where you had played. Maybe we still can, Rose said quietly. Maybe this is where we start again. Isaac looked at his daughter with surprise. Start again? Rose, that place is buried under tons of rock and snow. There's nothing left to build on. Not the exact same spot, Rose said patiently, but somewhere nearby. Papa, this valley is part of my heritage, part of who I am. I don't want to be afraid of it. I want to reclaim it. They made their way carefully down into the valley, Isaac's memories growing more vivid with each step. He showed Rose where their garden had been, where Margaret had grown vegetables and flowers that had brightened their table through the long mountain winters. He pointed out the spot where he had built Rose's swing, where she had spent countless summer afternoons soaring back and forth while Margaret worked nearby. The well is still here, Rose observed, brushing snow away from the stone rim that marked the water source Isaac had dug by hand their first summer in the valley. Good water, Isaac said, cold and sweet, even in the driest years. Rose stood beside the well, looking up at the avalanche scar with a thoughtful expression. Tell me what happened that day. I need to understand. Isaac closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember details he had tried for 18 years to forget. I had gone up to check my trap lines. It was early morning, and you and your mother were still sleeping when I left. The snow had been heavy that winter, and there had been some warm days followed by cold nights, conditions that make avalanches more likely. You warned Mama about the danger? I should have, Isaac said with the weight of old guilt. I knew the signs, but I thought we were far enough from the steep slopes to be safe. I was wrong. Rose moved to stand beside her father, taking his arm in a gesture of comfort. You couldn't have known exactly when or where it would happen. Papa, you can't blame yourself for forces beyond your control. I was supposed to protect you both, and you did, in every way you could. You built us a home, you provided for us, you loved us. What happened wasn't your fault, it was just the mountain being the mountain. Isaac opened his eyes and looked at his daughter, seeing in her face a wisdom that went beyond her years. The Hartleys had raised her well, teaching her not just facts and skills, but the kind of emotional intelligence that allowed her to comfort a grieving father while processing her own complex feelings about their shared tragedy. I heard the rumble from up the mountain, Isaac continued. By the time I got back here, everything was buried. The house, the barn, everything we had built gone, under a river of snow and rock that was already freezing solid. And you searched for us. For 3 days. Other men came to help, but the snow was too deep, too hard. When we finally found your mother, she was... Isaac's voice broke. She was holding a bundle that we thought was you. We were so focused on the grief of finding her that we didn't look closely enough to realize the bundle was just blankets and clothing. Rose squeezed his arm. So I was thrown clear somehow. Knocked unconscious, maybe, and buried just deep enough to be protected, but not so deep that I couldn't dig my way out when I came to. You were always resourceful, Isaac said with a mixture of pride and amazement. Even as a little girl, you had a talent for getting yourself out of trouble. I should have known that not even an avalanche could keep you down for long. Rose laughed, and the sound echoed across the valley like a benediction. Mama always said I was too stubborn to die easily. As afternoon faded into evening, they made camp in the ruins of Isaac's old life, father and daughter, sitting beside a fire built from dead wood that had once been part of their fence posts. The circle was completing itself. The place that had been the scene of their separation was now witnessing their reunion. "Papa," Rose said as they prepared for sleep, "tomorrow I want to visit Mama's grave. I want to tell her I'm home." Isaac nodded, understanding that this pilgrimage would not be complete until Rose had paid her respects to the mother she barely remembered but had never stopped loving. The wooden cross that marked Margaret's resting place was only a few miles away, in the small cemetery behind the settlement's church. But tonight they would sleep in the valley, where they had once been a family, under the same stars that had watched over their happiness and their sorrow, dreaming of the future they would build on the foundation of everything they had survived. The small cemetery behind the settlement church sat on a gentle hillside overlooking the valley, its modest collection of wooden crosses and stone markers bearing witness to the lives and losses of Montana Territory's hardy pioneers. Isaac had not visited this place since the day he buried Margaret, but he found Margaret's grave immediately, as if his feet remembered the path his heart had walked in grief 18 years ago. The wooden cross he had carved still stood straight and strong, weathered by mountain storms but unbroken. The words he had burned into the wood with painstaking care were still legible: Margaret Rose Magnus, beloved wife and mother, 1835 to 1864. Until we meet again. Beside it stood a smaller cross, bearing Rose's name and dates, the grave marker for a child who had never actually been buried there. Isaac stared at the second cross with a mixture of guilt and wonder, understanding for the first time that he had been mourning at an empty grave for 18 years. "Hello, Mama," Rose said softly, kneeling beside Margaret's headstone. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come see you." Isaac watched his daughter commune with the mother she barely remembered, feeling his heart crack open with a pain that was somehow healing rather than destructive. Rose placed her hand on the earth above Margaret's grave, her eyes closed in concentration, as if she were trying to absorb some sense of the woman who had given her life. "Papa," Rose said without opening her eyes, "tell me what you would say to her if she were here." Isaac knelt beside his daughter, his hand joining hers on the cold earth. "I would tell her that I kept my promise, that I survived, even when I didn't want to, that I raised our daughter." His voice caught. "That I would have raised our daughter to be exactly the kind of woman she became anyway, strong and kind and wise." "What else?" "I would tell her that I never stopped loving her, but I understand now that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes form. The love I had for her helped me recognize you when you came to my door. It's still there, still part of who I am." Rose opened her eyes and looked at the wooden cross that had marked her supposed grave. "We need to take this down, Papa. It's served its purpose, but it's not needed anymore." Isaac hesitated. That cross had been his focal point for grief, the physical marker that had allowed him to have a place to bring his sorrow. Removing it felt like erasing part of his history, even though he understood Rose was right. "Help me," he said finally. Together, they worked the smaller cross free from the frozen ground. Isaac handled the weathered wood with reverence, understanding that it represented not just his daughter's supposed death, but his own long journey through grief toward acceptance and healing. "What should we do with it?" Rose asked. Isaac studied the cross, reading the dates that marked a life that had never actually ended. An idea began to form in his mind, something that felt right in ways he couldn't fully explain. "We'll keep it," he said, "but we'll change what it represents. Instead of marking an ending, it can mark a new beginning." They spent the rest of the morning working together to restore Margaret's grave site, clearing away debris that had accumulated over the years of Isaac's absence. Rose gathered wildflowers that had somehow survived the early winter, their hardy blooms adding color to the stark landscape of snow and stone. "She would have liked you," Isaac said as they worked side by side. "Margaret always said she could judge people by how they treated things that couldn't do anything for them in return. You tend her grave like you knew her personally." "I feel like I do know her, in a way," Rose replied. "She's in you, Papa. The way you cared for me when I was hurt, the patience you showed when I was confused and frightened, that's Mama's influence. She taught you how to love someone unconditionally." Isaac felt tears freezing on his cheeks in the mountain cold. "She did. Margaret never loved by halves. When she chose to care about someone, it was with her whole heart, forever. Then she would understand why I need to ask you something difficult," Rose said, setting down the flowers she had been arranging. "Papa, I want to stay here. Not just visit, not just for a while. I want to make my life here, with you, in these mountains." Isaac studied his daughter's face, seeing determination mixed with hope. "Rose, you've had a life in civilization, education, comfort, society. Are you certain you want to give that up for the isolation of mountain living?" "I'm not giving anything up," Rose said firmly. "I'm choosing what I want. I've spent 18 years wondering where I belonged, feeling like something essential was missing from my life. Now I know what it was. I was missing my family, my heritage, my true home." Isaac pulled his daughter close, marveling at the solid reality of her presence, the miracle of having someone to hold again after so many years of empty arms. "Then we'll build something new together, a life that honors the past but isn't imprisoned by it." Rose smiled against his shoulder, "A life worthy of Mama's memory." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Isaac took one last look at Margaret's grave, no longer feeling the crushing weight of solitary grief that had brought him here so many times in memory. Instead, he felt something he had thought was lost forever, hope for the future, purpose beyond mere survival, the possibility of joy returning to his life in forms he had never dared imagine. The wooden cross that had once marked Rose's death was now tucked under his arm, ready to be transformed into something new, something that celebrated life instead of mourning loss. Behind them, Margaret's grave rested peacefully under its blanket of snow and flowers, watched over by the mountains that had claimed her, but had also, in their own mysterious way, given her daughter back to the man who loved them both. Spring arrived early that year. As if the mountains themselves were eager to support the new beginning, Isaac and Rose were building together. The snow began its retreat in March, revealing a world reborn beneath winter's blanket. Isaac watched his daughter discover the mountains spring with wonder, seeing familiar landmarks through eyes that held both childhood memories and adult appreciation. They had spent the winter months planning their new life, poring over Margaret's old recipe book by firelight, while Isaac shared stories of the dishes his wife had prepared with love and skill. Rose proved to be an eager student, her hands finding the same rhythms Margaret's had once followed, as she learned to make bread that filled the cabin with warmth and comfort. "The secret," Isaac explained, as Rose kneaded dough on the worn wooden table, "is in how you work the dough. Margaret used to say bread could tell if you were angry or sad or distracted. It responds to the mood of the baker." Rose paused in her kneading, looking thoughtful. "What mood should I bring to this?" "Gratitude," Isaac said without hesitation. "Gratitude for second chances, for family found, for the privilege of feeding someone you love. The bread that emerged from the oven that evening was golden and perfect, its crust crackling with the same satisfying sound Isaac remembered from hundreds of meals shared with Margaret. When Rose sliced it and offered him the first piece, still warm and fragrant, Isaac tasted not just flour and yeast, but the continuation of traditions he had thought were lost forever. As the weather warmed, they began working together to restore parts of their old homestead that were accessible and safe. The avalanche site itself remained dangerous, but the lower portions of the property could be reclaimed with careful effort. They cleared debris, rebuilt sections of fence, and planted a garden in the same spot where Margaret had once grown vegetables and flowers. "She would want us to make it beautiful again," Rose said as they worked side by side, their hands black with rich mountain soil. "Mama wouldn't want this place to stay empty and sad forever." Isaac watched his daughter work with the same intense focus Margaret had brought to gardening, seeing in her movements the echo of her mother's grace and determination. Rose had inherited more than just physical resemblance from Margaret. She had somehow absorbed her mother's ability to find hope in the darkest situations and to create beauty wherever she planted herself. One evening, as they sat on the porch Isaac had built to overlook their restored garden, Rose brought up the subject they had been dancing around for weeks. "Papa, I want to create a memorial, not just for Mama, but for the Hartleys too. They gave their lives to bring me home. Their sacrifice should be remembered and honored." Isaac had been thinking the same thing. The wooden cross that had once marked Rose's empty grave sat in his workshop, waiting to be transformed into something that celebrated life instead of mourning death. "I have an idea," he said. "What if we create a place where all the people who shaped our family can be remembered together? Margaret, the Hartleys, even the memories of who we used to be before we found each other again." They spent the following weeks working on Isaac's vision, creating a memorial garden in the meadow where Rose had once played as a child. Isaac carved new markers from seasoned pine, his hands remembering skills he had not used since Rose's childhood. Each piece was a work of art, as well as remembrance. Margaret's marker bore carved roses and musical notes representing the lullabies she had sung, while the Hartleys' memorial featured intertwined hearts, symbolizing the love that had raised Rose and brought her home. Rose's contribution was the centerpiece, a wooden bench positioned to overlook the entire valley, carved with words that captured the essence of their journey. "Love never dies, it only changes form." On the first anniversary of Rose's return to the mountains, they held a dedication ceremony for their memorial garden. It was a simple affair, just father and daughter sharing memories and hopes in the place where their family's story had been shattered and then, miraculously, made whole again. "To Margaret," Isaac said, raising a cup of coffee and toast, "who taught us that love is the strongest force in the world. To the Hartleys," Rose added, "who proved that families can be chosen as well as born. And to Second Chances," they said together, "for showing us that endings can become beginnings when we have the courage to believe in miracles." As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Isaac and Rose sat together on their memorial bench, planning the future they would build in this place where sorrow had been transformed into joy. The mountains that had taken so much from them had also given back immeasurably, proving that nature's greatest gift was not its beauty or its bounty, but its infinite capacity for renewal. "Papa," Rose said softly, "I think Mama would be proud of what we've built here." Isaac looked around at their restored garden, their memorial to love and loss and redemption, and at the remarkable woman his daughter had become. "I think she is proud, Rose. I think she's been watching over us all along, waiting for this moment when we would finally understand that love really is stronger than death." In the gathering twilight, surrounded by the ghosts of their past and the promises of their future, father and daughter sat in perfect peace, finally and completely home. 6 months after the dedication of their memorial garden, Isaac Magnus stood on the porch of his cabin, watching his daughter tend the flowers that now bloomed where Margaret had once planted them. The sight filled him with a contentment he had thought was lost forever, the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing broken things made whole again. Rose had indeed stayed, transforming herself from the confused young woman who had stumbled to his door into a confident mountain dweller who could read weather signs as well as any old-timer and could track game through terrain that would challenge an experienced hunter. But more than that, she had transformed Isaac himself, drawing him out of the isolation that had defined his existence for 18 years and reminding him what it meant to be part of a family. The cabin that had once felt like a hermit's cave now hummed with life and purpose. Rose had added feminine touches without erasing the masculine practicality that had kept Isaac alive. Curtains that let in more light, wildflowers in mason jars, the smell of fresh bread that made the simple space feel like a home rather than just a shelter. "Papa," Rose called from the garden, "the tomatoes are ready for picking. Should I harvest them all or leave some for later in the week?" Isaac smiled at the question, remembering similar conversations with Margaret about timing and abundance and the delicate art of making the most of mountain-growing seasons. "Take what's ripe today. We'll preserve what we can't eat fresh." As Rose worked among the plants, Isaac reflected on the changes that had reshaped both their lives. The settlement folk had initially been skeptical of the story of Rose's return, but the evidence had been overwhelming, and the community had eventually embraced the miracle with the mixture of wonder and acceptance that frontier life demanded. Impossible things happened regularly in the wilderness. Men survived avalanches, families were separated and reunited, death sometimes gave back what it had taken. Dr. Morrison from Copper Falls had made several trips to examine Rose and confirm her identity for the territorial records. He had found the old scar on her scalp, where she had been injured as a child, had matched her bone structure to the family photographs, and had documented the remarkable consistency of her recovered memories with Isaac's accounts of their life before the avalanche. "It's the most extraordinary case I've encountered in 30 years of frontier medicine," the doctor had told Isaac. "The human capacity for survival, especially in children, never ceases to amaze me. Your daughter is living proof that miracles do happen, even in places where logic suggests they shouldn't." The new family portrait that now sat on Isaac's mantel was a study in contrasts to the weathered daguerreotype it had replaced. Where the old image had captured a young family frozen in time, this new photograph showed a mature man and woman who had lived through loss and found each other again. Isaac's face, lined by years of solitude and grief, now showed traces of the contentment he had rediscovered. Rose's expression combined the wisdom of someone who had traveled a difficult path with the joy of someone who had finally found where she belonged. The photographer in Copper Falls had been honored to create the image, understanding its significance in the community's collective memory. "This picture will be talked about for generations," he had told them as he arranged the pose. "The story of the mountain man who got his daughter back. It's the kind of tale people tell their grandchildren to prove that hope should never be abandoned." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant shades of gold, crimson, Isaac and Rose established the rhythms that would carry them through their second winter together. They worked side by side, preserving the garden's harvest, smoking meat from Isaac's hunting expeditions, and preparing the cabin for the cold months ahead. But unlike the previous 18 winters, this one held no dread, no sense of enduring rather than living. Rose had proven herself capable of handling the challenges of mountain isolation without losing the grace and intelligence the Hartleys had nurtured in her. She read voraciously from Isaac's collection of books, but she also learned to mend traps, split firewood, and navigate by the stars. She had become, in the truest sense, a daughter of both worlds, civilized society that had shaped her character and the wilderness that had claimed her heart. "I've been thinking about spring," Rose said one evening as they sat by the fire, she with her mending and Isaac with his carving. "About expanding the garden, maybe building a small greenhouse so we can grow fresh vegetables through the winter." Isaac looked up from the wooden toy. He was making a horse for the young son of a neighbor who had begun visiting regularly. The isolation that had once been complete was now punctuated by friendships, by connections to the broader community that made their mountain life feel chosen rather than imposed. "That's ambitious," he said with approval. "Your mother always wanted to try growing lettuce and herbs through the cold months. She would love knowing her daughter was fulfilling that dream." Rose smiled, and in that expression Isaac saw both Margaret's gentleness and his own determination. "I like to think she's watching us figure out how to be a family again. Sometimes, when I'm working in the garden, I feel like she's there, guiding my hands, helping me understand which plants will thrive and which need special care." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, each flake catching the light from their windows like tiny stars returning to earth. Isaac watched the snow accumulate on the windowsill and felt no trace of the dread that had once accompanied the arrival of winter weather. This snow brought not isolation but coziness, not survival but comfort, shared with someone he loved. "Rose," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life since your mother died. You've given me back not just my daughter, but my sense of purpose, my connection to the world beyond these mountains." Rose set down her mending and moved to sit beside his chair, taking his weathered hand in hers. "You saved my life twice, Papa. Once when you pulled me from that blizzard, and once when you loved me enough to help me remember who I really am. The Hartleys gave me 18 good years, but you gave me my true self back." As the snow continued to fall outside their warm cabin, Isaac Magnus held his daughter's hand and marveled at the unexpected mercy of a world that could take everything away, and then, when least expected, give back more than had ever been lost. The mountains that had broken his heart had also healed it, proving that some stories have no real ending, only transformation, renewal, and the endless possibility of love finding its way home.